this first. Sorry, yes. Hi, everyone. So for next week's poll, for week 16, we are going to ask everyone if you could kindly complete the questionnaire, Meaning in Life questionnaire, and it's on the next slide, and there's some explanation on how to complete it. There is some hard copies here for the people who came in person for you to complete, but we encourage you to complete that prior to next week's session. And that explains there that we will ask you to do the questionnaire at home and score it. If you would like, we can anonymously share your score with next week as part of our poll. We will be emailing the following slides out to everyone. So there is an explanation on the Meaning in Life questionnaire. Just a reminder, it isn't a test and there's no right score. It is a scale we're hoping will encourage you to think about meaning in your life. Some people feel a strong sense of meaning, but aren't actively searching. Others are searching deeply, but don't yet feel they've found it. Both positions are deeply human, and both tell us something important about where we are right now. There is a questionnaire. So it kind of gives you directions on how to complete. And there is a scale there to mark in your responses. Okay. So the Meaning in Life questionnaire consists of 2 subscales. The presence of meaning. I don't have to? No. Okay, we encourage you to go back and review the meaning of it. Yeah. Okay, and that's that. And this is what we're doing today. We're all talking about stress. And in 2 weeks, we'll discuss traumatic stress. And in 4 weeks, we'll explore dissociation. There we are. But is Lauren going to ask her question
yeah.
first?
Hi, Lauren.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, having some technical difficulties. So sorry about that, and I don't want to take up too much time with this, but I just want to honor the online group because we had a good discussion in our debrief last week, and it was asked that we maybe get some of Dr. Clado's insights from this, and perhaps further discussion can happen, not during this because I don't want to take up too much time, but it was sort of shared during the debrief that a couple of people felt triggered, sort of outside the window of tolerance at the mention of some events in the US, mention of Trump, mention of Minneapolis, and somebody had suggested maybe topics like that best not to bring up. Because it can be triggering. And then we kind of did a little bit of a chain analysis of that reaction. And we had a conversation about how, we can't always avoid things that will come up in conversations and that are triggers. And so sometimes even conversations in the course can be a good opportunity to use our own tools and skills to cope with those things. And so basically, we just sort of wanted some of your insight there, Dr. Clado, and people wanted you to be aware that that was something. It's good that we're talking about stress today that caused some stress for some people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, it's one of the stresses that we face, right? And so let's see what we're going to say today. And I think we handle, because life throws a lot of stresses at us, whether it's like more personal things or global events. I think we use the same ways of dealing with them all, right? It's the stuff that we're learning. So yeah. And this is, I think, a good topic for Mondays, where we have much more time to explore, things informally. So I invite those people to come on Monday, if they want to talk about that a little bit more. Okay, yeah. So this is because there are some people that will be doing the course on YouTube, and they're not doing it in person or on Zoom live, right? So I have to, just explain that we forgot to record from the beginning. So there'll be a section for those people who are doing this on YouTube. There'll be a section at the beginning, which is most like reminders and what we do at the beginning of every course that will be missing. But you'll still get the important material from the course. So just apologize for that. Okay, so sometimes we start with a quotation, and today we're talking about stress and trauma. And I thought quotation by Nietzsche, who had a very, very stressful life, right? In so many different ways. And he said, this is a famous quotation from him: resilient individuals divine remedies for injuries. They know how to turn serious accidents to their advantage. That which does not kill them makes them stronger. And we're going to talk about, when we talk about trauma, we're going to see how trauma can break us, but trauma can also make us stronger. But we'll touch more on that in a couple of weeks. And the other one is by Ernest Hemingway. The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are stronger at the broken places, which reminds me of, and I showed you a picture of that Japanese art of putting broken pottery together. Forget the name, Unani? Okay, don't remember it, but you make something beautiful out of something broken. So it's Hemingway's way of saying that. Okay. So let's just begin with a brief introduction. So we're kind of switching gears a little bit, because remember, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Remember, we're talking about, so we started, this whole thing is about personality, right? And personality development. And, we talked about instincts, right? And we said we have, all these different instincts: seeking and avoidance. We have fight and flight. We have sexuality. We have attachment. We have play, right? And those instincts, they underlie our emotions. And this course, we're dealing with emotional dysregulation a lot, right? So what happens is that the world, so we have these instincts, and we come to the world with our temperament. So instincts are already kind of more geared one way or another, right? But then what happens to us affects instincts, affects how our emotions work, right? And affects our personality. Okay, so this is what we're unpacking. And we talked about attachment. We spent a couple of sessions on attachment because that's, those early relationships with our caregivers are very influential in terms of our personality. Now we're kind of, just moving away from relationship with caregivers, and we're going to focus more on stress from other sources, right? So, because that's also a source of stress. And what happens with our caregivers also affects not just our attachment instinct, but affects our fight and flight, right? But stress affects fight and flight a lot, the other instinct, okay? So this is what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to repeat what I just said. So one of the goals of this course is to be a simple owner's manual to the mind. When you buy a car, it comes along with an owner's manual. Babies don't come along with an owner's manual. Okay? But this course is like, okay, consider this your owner's manual to your mind. And so in our quest to survive and thrive in an often hostile world, we're constantly interacting and being challenged by our environment. Okay? If each time we faced an environmental challenge or stress, we had to figure out anew the best response to it, we wouldn't survive because, we'd be paralyzed. Like, how do I handle this, right? So we have mechanisms that we respond automatically to stresses. Okay? So our response to our often hostile world are therefore pre-programmed. We're not inventing it each time. Personality is what we call that pre-programming. So our personalities are our ways of dealing with stress. It's kind of like an armor that we have. So personality, along with the immune and endocrine systems, are our first line of defense or protection for environmental challenges. Okay, so there's stresses that we deal with personality. There's stresses that we deal with our immune system. You know, if it's like a virus or bacteria. So there's different ways, but we have to deal with the stress. We have to have some way of coping with things that challenge us. So in the course, we've been exploring what leads to emotional dysregulation. Those recurring, so emotional dysregulations, those recurring patterns in our thinking, feeling, and behaving that constitute personality and cause us to fall into what we call holes, right? So that's part of our personality. So far, we've explored how personality is influenced by three important factors. So we talked about this quite a few weeks ago. So one is our temperament, we're born with, right? So some people are very sensitive. Some people have neuroatypical things going on, right? So that's all part of temperament. You're like that from the get-go. But then there's character. Character is what happens to us and how the world treats us. And then the third thing we said is that in addition to temperament and to character, or what happens to us, is there's integration. So it's what we do, right? How we process that information. So integration is how we reflect on, influence, and gradually change ourselves over time. So doing this course is part of integration, right? So you're modifying your personality in that way, right? Okay. So we've discussed how personality lives in our four minds. So we did that when we talked about the developmental maturational model, right? And four minds, as you know, are the somatic, the body mind, okay? The emotional, the rational, and the self-aware minds. So we can consider ourselves as having four parallel minds that are greatly influential within us. Okay, and how instincts are the basis of emotions. We've also considered how attachment and instinctive systems shaped by early caregivers, right? So attachment, we spent a couple of weeks on that, can either support emotional regulation if you have secure attachment, or contribute to dysregulation. So if you have insecure attachment, there's more likely to be emotional dysregulation when safety, connection, and are inconsistent or threatening. Okay. So today we're going to begin exploring another influence on our personalities and a major cause of emotional dysregulation and of psychological problems, right? It's stress and trauma. And stress and trauma affect another instinctive system, our fight, flight, freeze, and collapse responses. Stress and trauma don't just live in our thoughts. They live in our nervous systems and bodies. They shape what feels safe, what feels dangerous, how quickly we react, and how hard it is to pause, reflect, and choose. If we want to understand ourselves more fully, why we fall into certain holes, why some situations overwhelm us, what true healing and growth require, we need to understand stress and trauma. So as we continue the journey of trying to understand ourselves, we may also want to remind ourselves why approaches like DBT and IFS are so essential in healing and growth. Under conditions of stress, especially chronic or traumatic stress, our nervous systems are pulled out of balance. We shift out of calm, rational, flexible states and into survival modes. And we live that way, right? It's not just temporarily. You become chronically fight, flight, or freeze, right? In DBT language, you move out of rational mind and into emotional mind. And that may not just be for a short period of time. That may be maybe like out of the window of tolerance a lot of the time, because that's where our bodies are. So DBT gives us practical tools and skills to stabilize our nervous system. These help us slow down, widen our window of tolerance, and regain enough balance to reflect rather than react. Because that's where we want to move, from reacting to reflecting, right? Which involves wise mind or self. Internal family systems, which we'll begin exploring in week 21. So this is week 15. So it's not that long, like in 6 weeks, and then we're going to spend 9 weeks talking about internal family systems. That's March 4th, adds another layer. It helps us to understand that under stress, different parts or subpersonalities that exist in our internal families. We have an internal family as much as we have external families. Take over and why, when stress is high, access to our real, calm, clear, and compassionate core capital S self becomes so difficult. And don't worry about this because we haven't talked about it a lot, but it'll make more sense when we get there. Understanding stress and trauma helps us understand why the tools and skills sometimes feel so hard to use, why extreme parts of us sometimes take over, and why healing is not about forcing change, but about restoring safety. Okay, so that's just a little bit of introduction of stress and trauma because we're going to spend quite a bit of time on it. So these are the topics we're going to touch on today. So, we usually like to start by defining terms, just having a little bit of a dictionary of terms. We're going to talk about the differences between stress, fear, and anxiety. We're going to talk about how stress is diagnosed, go over DSM and stuff like that. We're going to talk about intensity and duration of stress and why that matters. Spend a bit of time talking about different types of stressors, such as socioeconomic, discrimination, gaslighting. And one that I should have added is, it's not in here, but it's like weather stress. I just kind of realized that, oh my God, that's so stressful, right? So winter is like a weather stress, but that's not in there. But I think we all understand that. And we're going to talk about how to assess stress. And I hope you all got the scales on an email. And we're going to do a poll. You could give us your scores if you like. We're going to talk about, and I think we're going to take a break at that point. We're going to talk about polyvagal theory, which is a really neat way of understanding trauma. So it's critical to understanding trauma. We're going to talk about arousal states, which you guys already know a lot about, which are essentially, fight, flight, freeze, calm, right? And we're going to by talking about how stress affects body and mind, signs and symptoms, and how it affects performance as well. And just talk a little bit about how stress affects children differently than adults. And we're going to finish with something called life history theory. So that's an ambitious thing. There's a lot of topics, right? But hey, we're pretty ambitious in this course. So here we go. And oh yeah, we have a couple of people, at least I think, that are joining us for the first time. So I want to welcome them. And I hope you're not too overwhelmed because, you're starting like week 15. So, okay, so let's start with some definitions. And I think this bears kind of really saying right off the top is that, we talk a lot about illness, right? Talk about disease and illness. And, if you remember the difference, disease, you actually have to have a physiological cause. So if you have cardiovascular disease, there's actually physiological changes. Illness is different. Illness is just a subjective feeling that you're not feeling well. And it could be, sort of psychological, it could be physical, it could be socioeconomic. So illness is just not feeling well, right? And so remember that definition. Stress is by far the most common cause of illness or feeling physically or emotionally unwell, okay, in the whole world. So that's the biggest cause of illness in the whole world is stress. So this is a pretty important topic. So let's define some terms. A stressor is a physical or psychological challenge to the well-being of an organism. So that's what happens, something outside of you. Stress is what a stressor causes. So it's what happens inside of you. It's an organism's physiological and psychological reaction to a stressor. Okay. So stressors, again, what happens, stuff that happens, and stress can be acute, longer term, or chronic, and range from mild to severe. Acute, lower intensity stressors are less damaging and even strengthen the organism. So it's good to have a little bit of stress, right? We know that if your immune system isn't challenged, right, when you're a baby, you don't develop good immunity. If you don't do some exercise, it's exercise is a form of stress, but it's, beneficial stress. Chronic high-intensity stressors are more harmful to the organism. And there's a concept called anti-fragility, which means that means benefiting from stress, shocks, or disorder, growing stronger instead of just resisting damage. Something fragile breaks under, so something that's fragile, like if you have a glass, right, and it falls, it breaks, right? Something robust resists stress, but it doesn't improve. So if you have like a plastic cup, it'll fall, it won't break, right? But so this is where anti-fragile is different from something that's fragile or something that's robust. So when you're anti-fragile is something that actually improves because of stress, which is different than being robust or fragile. And human beings are anti-fragile, right? If there's just a little bit of stress, we actually improve. And there's many forms of stress that are beneficial, right? As long as it's adaptive stress and it's not too intense. All right, resilience, the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from stressful circumstances, right? So remember, anti-fragile is something that you actually have to develop. It's if you're say with exercise, right? If you haven't exercised ever, right, and then you try to run a marathon, that's like too much of a stress for your body. But if you train, you're training your anti-fragility, and you can do this course is kind of a form of anti-fragility. Okay, so you're training yourself to become be able to withstand stress better. Okay, so resilience is something that can grow as you become more anti-fragile and develop your anti-fragility. So it's the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from stressful circumstances. That's what we want to do. We want to train our anti-fragility and become more resilient. All right. Now, eustress is a physical or psychological stress that benefits or strengthens the organism. Okay, so that's what helps you to become more resilient. It's what anti-fragility is. So eustress is tolerable stress. So engaging or exercise or engaging in intellectually or emotionally challenging activity. That's good, because if you don't have that, you're not going to develop that resilience or anti-fragility, right? This is where it begins to be more challenging, is the stress. Now, that's an aversive state of stress to which the person cannot fully adapt, but which may not have long-term negative effects. That's the stress. Okay, they all have the same kind of root of the word, stress. And then this is where it's more intense, is where you have traumatic stress, is a stressor that emotionally overwhelms the individual coping mechanisms and may have long-term consequences such as PTSD or complex PTSD. So stress isn't just good or bad. Eustress is actually good. When you get into the stress, it's starting to challenge you, that may not have like long-term effects, right? And then when you get into traumatic stress, it overwhelms you. But all of this depends on how resilient you are. The more resilient, the more, this picture changes a little bit. Because if you're more resilient, things that are distressing to somebody who's not as resilient are not going to be distressing to somebody who's more resilient. Okay. So hope that makes sense. And then we talk about stress coping resources. So these are resources that we use to cope with stresses. So they determine how people cope with stress. They include attachment style. So a secure attachment makes you more resilient. Coping skills, which is what we're learning in this course. Social supports. Do we have a network of people around us? Socioeconomic factors. So if you're in poverty, makes you less resilient, right? Generally. These resources determine for each person the point at which eustress becomes distress and distress traumatic stress. So the more coping resources you have, the more you can withstand the distress around you, right? Because coping resources buffer you. All right, so let's move on to talking about the differences between stress, fear, and anxiety, because those are often, terms that we use interchangeably sometimes: stress, fear, anxiety. Well, what's the difference between them? And this is like a little bit technical, but so be it. So, and because these are psychological definitions, right? So stress is a normal reaction to challenges in life. Stress is normal, right? Remember, stress is what you feel, subjective, right? It can cause physical and emotional symptoms, but it usually settles when the situation improves. So there's no avoiding stress, right? It's everywhere. However, anxiety is different. So stress is not anxiety. And this is like a clinical definition. Anxiety is when worry and physical symptoms become excessive and long-lasting, often continuing even when there's no clear threat. Okay, so stress is normal, and you can't avoid stress, and it's okay. But anxiety, it begins to be a problem. It may be kind of the after effects of too much stress in your life. Fear, in contrast, is usually brief and linked to a clear danger, while anxiety tends to linger and feel more vague or uncertain. So that's an important distinction. So fear is like, if there's a dog attacking you, you're going to have fear. All right. But when, the dog isn't there anymore, fear goes away. So it's fear, there has to be like kind of explicit external kind of threat that you can see. Anxiety, you may feel it even if there's no threat. I'm anxious, but I don't know why, right? So trauma, chronic stress, and attachment difficulties can disrupt the body's stress system, making people more vulnerable to anxiety and depression later in life. So this is where the dysregulation can happen, right? So if you have trauma, it kind of changes your system and you become more vulnerable, right? Or attachment issues, it changes your whole system. And unless you kind of heal, you're going to be more vulnerable to stress. Okay, when emotions are dysregulated, so we've talked a lot about that, what happens, as you know, is the body stays stuck in a high alert or shutdown state, fight or flight, or shutdown, right? Or depression and dissociation, instead of being calmed or balanced. So narrow window of tolerance. Because of this, the brain interprets everyday situations as dangerous or overwhelming, triggering a strong stress response. We've already talked about this, right? So I'm just kind of repeating this. People in this state, so people who are outside the window of tolerance, have more difficulty using healthy coping strategies, which makes stress last longer. Because if you're an emotional mind, it's hard to access your coping strategies. This creates a vicious cycle. Stronger stress, people may not have access to coping strategies, and it perpetuates this stress, right? So research shows that people with early life adversity have much stronger stress hormone responses, even to mild stressors. And there was a famous experiment where they took two groups of people. So one group, they'd had a traumatic childhood, okay? And another group had not had a traumatic childhood. And what they did is they subjected them to like a sort of equivalent stress. And what they did is that they asked them, are you willing to be, briefly interviewed? And it was kind of a neutral topic, but in front of a class of about 30 psychology students. Okay. And then what they did is that they measured, so this is like a same stress, right? 30 psychology students listening to you talk about a neutral topic. It wasn't about your trauma or anything. It was like about the weather or being interviewed about something. And then they all had their blood taken and they looked at, sort of hormones flowing in their blood. And what they found was that the people who had traumatic childhood had about 10 times as much stress hormones in their blood as people didn't have trauma, right? Just by being interviewed. So people who have trauma have a much stronger stress response, right? And that's physiological. And I think that makes sense. It kind of is what we've been talking about here. All right, so let's talk about how stress is diagnosed. How does the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, which you know about, categorize stress-related disorders? Okay. So I think it's safe to say that stress contributes to all mental health problems. I can't think of any mental health problem that stress isn't at least a little bit of, right? But in some conditions, stress is the major cause. Like it's all mental health issues, probably stress, but for some, it's like it's the biggest factor. This happens especially when stress is chronic, severe, or traumatic. So stress plays a central role in what are called, so there's a section in the DSM called the anxiety disorders. And the anxiety disorders, there's panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, social phobia, and specific phobias. Those are the main anxiety disorders, right? Stress also plays a central role in what are called, so this is another section of the DSM, and they're called the obsessive compulsive, stereotypic, and related disorders. And what comes under that heading are obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphia, which is having, it happens a lot in people who have eating disorders. They have a distorted image of their body. My head is really big, or my nose is really big, or I'm really, big, and actually the person isn't that big. So those are called the body dysmorphia. Hoarding, hair pulling, and skin picking. Those are the categories within obsessive compulsive, stereotypic, and related disorders. Okay, and then stress also plays a central role in the trauma and stress related disorders. I mean, that's pretty obvious. So PTSD, but that's the most common, the best known of the stress related disorders. But there's also acute stress disorder. That's another one in DSM. And then you have adjustment disorders, and you have reactive attachment disorders. I'm going to define all of those. I'm going to tell you what they are in a minute. And then the last thing that stress plays a central role in is the dissociative disorders. So dissociative identity disorder, which is formerly known as multiple personality disorder, depersonalization, derealization, and dissociative amnesia. So those are all DSM-5 diagnoses, okay? And all those diagnoses, stress plays a central role. Okay, let's talk, how are we doing for time? We're doing good. Okay, so we'll talk briefly about the importance of the intensity and duration of stress. And that, again, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if it's less intense and if it's a shorter duration, it's less likely to affect you as much, right? So, all right. So this is where the perceived stress comes in. And perceived stress means like, how do you perceive it? How do you feel the stress? So the definition of perceived stress is intensity. How intense is the stress that you're facing? Plus duration. How long does that stress last? Minus the coping resources available to an individual. So when because we asked you to try to take that scale. So yeah, I mean, it's gonna be more intense if it's good, you're gonna perceive more stress if it's more intense, if it lasts longer, and it also depends on your coping resources. So the perceived stress scale, which we emailed out, measures the person's stress level or the degree to which situations in their life are perceived as stressful. Factors affecting the stress levels include intensity and duration of the stress, coping skills, and the person's baseline physiological activation patterns. So positive reduced stress is associated with brief increases in heart rate, intensified focus, and mild elevations in levels of stress hormones. Tolerable stress. So being up here, like, because I get pretty worked up, it's kind of like, it's a tolerable stress. I'm kind of enjoying it at the same time. But it is like a little bit stressful because I'm on the spot, right? So better not screw this up. Yeah, tolerable stress, which we talked about earlier, which is the stress, right, is associated with serious but temporary stress responses mitigated by positive buffering influences, for example, self-regulation skills or supportive relationships. And this is where your, coping skills really make a difference, right? And then you have toxic stress, which involves intense and prolonged activation of stress response systems without sufficient positive buffering. Yeah, so it's not offset by anything. And that's where it really begins to be very damaging, right? So duration of stress, because as you know, it can be acute, it could be semi-chronic, or it can be chronic. So the stress response is part of our fight or flight system. Short-term stress is normal, helpful, and supports survival. So eustress, okay, builds resilience, anti-fragility. Long-term stress can develop when stressors are chronic, emotions are poorly regulated, or stress and dysregulation reinforce each other in a vicious cycle. Okay? As stress becomes more intense and long-lasting, the stress system becomes dysregulated and causes physical and psychological harm. So, the more intense and prolonged, it not only causes you direct harm, but it starts to dysregulate your stress response. And that can be long-term. That's why PTSD, right, is not just a short-term dysregulation. It can go on until it's addressed, right, until it's healed. So severe or toxic stress can eventually lead to shutdown states such as depression, dissociation, or emotional collapse. All right, so stress has 3 layers. I think this is an important slide. So one is world. That's one layer of stress. It's what happens to you? What's happened to you? The other layer is your body, and we're going to talk more about this, one of these at a time, okay? The other layer is your body. It's your arousal, your physiology, your biology, what's happening in your body. And the third one is identity. So what do you make of this? What do you make of what's happening in your body and in the world? Okay, so we're going to take those one at a time here. So let's start by talking about the world. What happened? So stress, that's one layer of stress. What does life do to us? Let's talk about that. Okay, so this section is about the varieties of stressors, including socioeconomic, discrimination, gaslighting, and so on and so on, okay?
No new message.
All right, so many different things can cause stress, right? Stress isn't only triggered by negative events. Positive life changes like marriage, having a baby, starting a new job, moving, or traveling, which can be positive, those are also stressful, okay? So some of the common stressors include, sensory inputs. When there's just too much, right? Your senses can't, they're struggling to cope. So pain is a sensory input, right? That can be really stressful. Pain is hugely stressful, right? Especially if it's chronic, right? Very bright lights, very stressful. Noise, a lot of noise. Temperature extremes. We often don't think these things are stressful, but they can be very stressful, right? And our environment these days is full of these things, right? Yeah, like now living in Stratford is it's a nice, more calm environment. You're not assaulted. Your senses aren't assaulted by all this stuff. When I go to Toronto, right, it's overwhelming, the noise and stuff. And what happens is that we build resilience. So if you live in Toronto, you kind of like become a little bit anti-fragile to the sensory overwhelm. But if you're going from Stratford to Toronto, you feel like, oh, this is overwhelming. It can be very stressful. And I'm always glad to come back because I'm kind of like, I'm happy to go because, usually we're doing something fun, but it's like, oh my God, it's like the traffic. I was talking to somebody yesterday who, her husband is a truck driver. Oh, you were there. Oh, you were there, Nicole. So, and he drives from near Exeter, I think, right? Drives from Exeter to Toronto every day. And then he delivers stuff in Toronto, right? And he can't get out of his truck for some reason. I didn't completely understand. But he has to stay in his truck all day. And then he drives back home to Exeter, right? On the 401 in his truck. It's like, and Poor guy, he was having chest pains and I don't think he's very old, right? He was having chest pains and, he had a cardiac workup and it was negative. Right? His doctor said, you have to change jobs. Because that's very stressful, right? Just driving the 401s, like, yeah. Okay, so sensory inputs, right? Environmental circumstances. So things like food, water, or housing insecurity, pollution, lack of freedom or mobility, right? Social circumstances, such as dealing with difficult people, going through a breakup, divorce, marriage, births, or deaths. Okay, so social circumstances can be very stressful. Adverse experiences during development, such as maternal exposure to trauma or toxic substances, that affects the fetus, right? Attachment issues, infant child abuse, and neglect, right? So these are some varieties of types of stressors that sometimes we don't think about. Oops. Okay. However, I'm repeating this because, well, I'm not repeating this, but the world's number one stressor is poverty, okay, not having socioeconomic difficulties, right? So humans are driven by instincts. Our instincts are seeking an avoidance, attachment, fight or flight. And what those instincts, what the purpose that they serve is that they drive us to get what we need to survive, right? That's the purpose of all instincts. So how a society distributes resources, right, which is called the economy, right? Societies all do it a little bit differently, but how a society distributes resources strongly affects how stressful life is for its people, right? Inequality and economic injustice create chronic stress and are among the biggest causes of illness worldwide. This is something we don't talk about. We talk about in psychiatry, we talk about, stress and stress disorders and anxiety disorders, but we kind of ignore a little bit kind of the social components, right? So I think this is really important, is socioeconomic stressors are the biggest source of stress for people everywhere in the world, right? Now, put that together because, an argument that people usually have is that, oh, you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, upward mobility, if you work hard, right, anybody can make anything of themselves, okay? That's like a myth, right? That's actually not true, right? But it's kind of a powerful myth that, if you work really hard, and there's like, there's like a few people that have done that, and that's fantastic. But statistically, it's not true at all. It's a common myth that, kind of perpetuates, if you're poor, it's like, no, it's like, let's not redistribute things more equitably because, if you wanted, you could raise yourself out of that, right? So it's kind of an excuse, right? So chronic stress, right? Chronic stress, so if you're very stressed, makes it harder for people to think clearly, plan, and this is important. Chronic stress makes it difficult, makes it hard for people to do the difficult things needed to change their situation. Okay? As a result, escaping poverty through willpower alone is very rare. Right? Upward mobility depends on social justice. And as inequality rises, upward mobility falls. Okay? So actually, in the US, which is like, the myth of upward mobility is like widespread because there's such inequality. It's one of the societies where there's the least upward mobility. I think at one point there might have been, but right now there's very little upward mobility. And it's in the societies that, are more socially oriented, right? Where there's less inequality, that because people aren't so stressed, they have the wherewithal right? It's called doing the hard thing, doing doing the hard thing when the hard thing is the right thing to do. Right? So sometimes the hard thing is the right thing to do. Right? But if you're stressed, it's very hard to do the hard thing, which is the right thing. So the more stressed you are, it's much easier to do not the right thing, right? Which is like being in a hole. That's why we're in holes. We're not doing the right thing. And because if you're trying to, live more from rational mind or from wise mind, right? It's very hard to do those right things, the rational mind or wise mind thing, right? It's much easier to do the thing that seems easy because it's emotional, right? But it turns out it's easy to get, angry or whatever, right? But then you kind of go, oh, that was kind of easy. I didn't have the wherewithal, to do the hard thing, which was the right thing. I don't know if that makes sense to people. Does that make sense? Okay. I was struggling with that a little bit, but okay. So, so this is why socioeconomic stress is the most important health concern, right? So your life, or how stressful it is the variable that has the biggest impact on your health. Okay, so how stressful your life is the variable that has the most impact on your health. Right? Now, the healthcare you receive, your biology, and your physical environment are comparatively less important factors. That's hard to believe, right? Because we're taught it's healthcare, it's our biology, okay? But this is well studied, right? And that's what that slide says, is that 50% of what makes you sick is stuff from your life, right? So things like income, early childhood development, disability, education, social exclusion. You can read that list in the slides afterwards. 25% of your health has to do with your healthcare. So access to healthcare, healthcare systems, wait times. 15% it's your biology, your genetics, okay? And 10% in environmental factors like air quality and infrastructure. So I think that's a little challenging, right? And it's a little hard to believe, but yeah, it's your life that really determines your health. Then the social factors and circumstances that impact your health are called social determinants of health. Okay, repeat that. The social factors and circumstances, and this is like a whole field of research. It's fascinating. Social determinants of health. Right? The social factors and circumstances that impact your health are called social determinants of health. So the most important social determinants of health include educational, economic, and job opportunities, exposure to crime and violence, exposure to discrimination, housing and residential segregation, opportunities for recreational activities, poverty, public safety, social support, stress, transportation, and so on and so on. So bears repeating that social factors and circumstances that impact your health are called social determinants of health. And the most important social determinants of health include these things that I read. And those are the things that are most important in your health. Okay? And this is a study, it's a famous study called the Whitehall Studies, which looked a little bit at the social determinants of health from a different angle. And so what they did in the Whitehall studies, like in England, they have very good, they track, for civil servants. They have, universal health care, and they have good ways of tracking, outcomes among civil servants. So this study, the Whitehall studies, looked at mortality and morbidity, so illness and disease, and how when these people, civil servants died and stuff. Okay, so this is the really interesting thing. So the Whitehall studies of British civil servants clearly show that the more control you have over your life, the longer and healthier life you live. Longevity and health depends on a person's place in the social hierarchy, right? So this is just one of many, many conclusions of this study. So if you have, what you have there is you have kind of look at mortality, right? And they broke it down by a grade of employment. So they broke it down into senior, which is like people that are at the top of the pyramid. Okay, they're the managers and the bosses. Professional, so a little on the senior. Then you have clerical, and then you have support workers. And what you see there, it looks at mortality by grade. And in these large studies, so the higher you are on the hierarchy, right, that you're more senior, you're at the top of the pyramid, you have more control, the healthier and the longer you live. The lower you go, the more your health is affected, and the shorter you live. Okay? So, yeah. So let's look a little bit at, and these studies were actually done in Huron County. And so I kind of include them because they're local, and they're from a few years ago. But these are everyday stressors that we commonly face, right? And so one of the everyday stressors is experiences of discrimination. And this graph is the percentage of Huron-Perth respondents who reported experienced discrimination in one or more contexts in the past 3 years. This is like 4 or 5 years old, okay? And look at, because this relates to what we were talking about before, where you are on the hierarchy. So if you're immigrant and visible minority, so almost 70% of immigrants and visible minority reported experiences of discrimination. If you're Indigenous, 80% reported experiences of discrimination. And if you're a white non-immigrant, about 50%. So that's still like very considerable, right? But these are stressors, and stressors affect different populations differently, right? Okay, so then they also look, so this is the same study, so Huron-Perth counties. They looked at the type of discrimination experience, percentage who had experienced each type of discrimination. All right, and so they broke it down into things like inappropriate jokes, right? Immigrants, about 70%, Indigenous people, a little bit less. I mean, they have other types of discrimination, but maybe not this one. And white non-immigrants, 63%. Derogatory language. So these are things that we're all exposed to, right? I'm not going to go through all the statistics there. But so perceived basis for discrimination. So you ask these people, why do you think people discriminate against you, right? And immigrants and visible minorities, they said, well, it's because of my race or skin color, or because of my ethnicity or culture. Indigenous people, they said, well, I think they discriminate because of my Indigenous identity or ethnicity or culture. But among white non-immigrants, what they thought was that they were discriminated against because of their gender or physical appearance, right? So, okay, let's talk about gaslighting, because that's a term that I think kind of surfaced just a few years ago. But, we talk a lot about it, and I think it's really important. So the term gaslighting comes from the title of a 1938 British stage play, Gaslight, in which a male character uses psychological manipulation to make a female character question her sanity. Gaslighting is when one person, for their own gain, intentionally tries to twist, and it has to be intentional, right? Tries to twist another person's perception of reality. So if you hear these statements, these are typical gaslighting statements. You're overreacting. You need help. You're upset over nothing. You must be confused again. You're so dramatic. I never said that. I'm trying, as I go through these, I'm going, which ones do I say? So far, I'm actually pretty good. I know there's like a couple that I do say. Oh, yeah, stop imagining things. I was just joking. Okay, so I say that a lot to my wife. The other one is like pretty good. Like I'm keeping a checklist here. But yeah, I was just joking. Do people here, do a lot of people say that? Or am I the only one? Yeah, you say that? Yeah. 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 My wife doesn't believe that. So you're remembering things wrong. Or it's always something with you. Okay. So the more of these that you use, and there's a lot of other statements, the more, gaslighting is not all or nothing. It's like a little bit of a spectrum, right? So gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse and a chronic stressor in many relationships. And it's interesting, like with the joking thing, because I realized that it's also a cultural thing or a family thing. So I grew up in like a family where people use jokes to criticize or to say hurtful things, right? That was just my culture. And when I married my wife, I was just doing what everybody around me did. And so I started doing, and she came from a culture where people didn't do that. I was like, what are you talking about? It's like, I was just joking, because that's what it was. Like it was, and then I realized that, these are kind of jokes, but they're kind of pointed, they're sharp, and they hurt a little bit, right? So other examples of subtle common emotional abuse include, and these are pretty common, withholding affection as a punishment, not telling a person what they did wrong, but expecting them to ask for forgiveness, intentionally being forgetful about things and events that are important to the other person, and being patronizing. I had a discussion, I wonder if it was in the Boyne group, we had a discussion about being patronizing. I don't know where it was, but just recently, I was talking about that with somebody. We're going to break in just a few minutes, but let's get through this section first, and then we'll take our break. So we're still considering like the varieties of different stressors. So another one that, I think when we mention it, when we name it, it's like, well, yeah, but sometimes it just doesn't occur to us, but it's work-related stress. And there's like a whole literature on this, right? So, and there's terms that are used in this literature, such as operational or occupational stress injury. That's a thing, right? So, and this refers to lasting psychological harm from doing high stress service work, such as policing, firefighting, emergency response, or frontline healthcare. So that's called operational or occupational stress injury. And we see a lot of people like that. We see a lot of police and nurses, right, that are suffering consequences from stuff from their work. Also, moral injury or moral distress happens when people act in ways or witness situations that violate their deeply held values. Moral injury is more severe, while moral distress is usually milder. And then there's burnout. So these are all work-related, right? Yeah, burnout is emotional, physical, or mental exhaustion caused by prolonged stress, often related to work or caregiving, and is not the same as depression, even though they can look similar. And I think this is really important. So leadership and workplace culture matters greatly. Abusive, exploitative, or psychologically unhealthy leaderships leadership can severely damage morale and mental health. So I've worked in many different settings. And I've worked in, because I think like when you work in a team, it's like a little bit of a family, right? And it affects you because sometimes you could spend many hours a day with your team. And I've worked in teams that functioned like a securely attached family, right? Where, we came together and we support each other, we talk openly, I disagree with you, it was okay, and I worked in a team called the ACT team when I was at the hospital, which was like that, right? And that was just so empowering, and it made our work so easy because we had a lot of really challenging. The ACT team had a lot of really challenging clients, but because we all backed each other, it was great. I've worked in other teams where they function more like insecurely attached families, where everybody has their agenda, right? And I've heard this statement many, many times. In healthcare, I've heard people say this: if it was only our clients or our patients that we have to deal with, that would be easy. It's a team you work with. Haven't you heard that so many times? Yeah. So that's the opposite, right? Is that like the team you work with can interfere, right? With the work you're doing in any setting. And I think that, anyone can kind of set that tone. But I think people in positions of leadership within a team, they have more of a say. And if you have one person in a leadership position who's fucked, the whole team is fucked. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So we're almost at the, let me just cover this because, and then we'll go to our break. So we're just talking, and I think this is an important discussion because if we don't name these things, stress is all around us. We need to know, where it is in the world, right? So frequently unrecognized stressors. So being neurodivergent, for example, autistic, having ADHD or dyslexic, often means moving through a world that is designed with neurotypical norms and expectations in mind. Social rules, school systems, workplaces, even sensory environments like lighting, noise, schedules are usually tailored for typical ways of processing information and relating to others. For neurodivergent people, this creates a constant background stressor, a need to mask differences, adapt to environments that overload or misunderstand them, or repeatedly repair small ruptures in social and professional interactions. Over time, this ongoing mismatch functions like chronic stress, even when no single event looks dramatic from the outside. Okay? By the same token, there are other life experiences where the everyday environment is misaligned with one's capacities, expectations, or identity. These two can function as chronic stressors, and they include things like being an immigrant. Okay, so I was an immigrant. I came to Canada, I was 11, right? That was pretty stressful. So immigrating to an unfamiliar culture, navigating a language barrier, new norms, different values, and possible discrimination means that even simple interactions can carry strain. Living with a visible or invisible disability, constant negotiation with spaces, systems, and attitudes that aren't representational. I'm reading the wrong line. That aren't accessible. Belonging to a stigmatized minority group, dealing with prejudice, microaggressions, or the burden of representation. Chronic illness, another unrecognized stress. The daily management of symptoms, medical appointments, and limited energy narrows life choices. Gender or sexual identity, not affirmed by the mainstream culture. The stress of concealment, invalidation, or outright hostility. In each of these cases, the stress isn't only from specific events, but from the continuous friction between the individual's ways of being and the larger environment's design or expectations. Okay. So before we take our break, maybe just take 30 seconds and notice what, our discussion so far brought up for you. So let's pause for 30 seconds and I will time this. All right, Lauren, can you pause the recording, please?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. What I was thinking, because there's a section comes up in a little bit, but I think is really important, the polyvagal theory. So I think I'm going to skip over the next section, which is interesting, but I want to spend more time on the polyvagal. I also want to do the perceived stress scale, get your results. So I want to do the poll. So let's okay, I'm going to skip over that. Essentially that's just looking at it, say very quickly, is that people are feeling more and more stressed, right? And particularly young people. Young people are disproportionately more stressed than older people. People over 65, like me, they're like less stressed. It's like we don't care anymore. Gen Z is very stressed. Also reporting worsening mental health, right? Everybody generally in the whole world. So skip over that. And what it's particularly alarming with Gen Z, right? Which is people born between 1997, 2012. And probably a big factor in their deteriorating mental health is that they were the first generation to grow up with cell phones, smartphones, right? And when that first happened, it was all new to us. It's like smartphones, how bad can it be? But now we're realizing that it's had many consequences, and it's just beginning to show up in people's mental health. So, and that's a very important subject, but we can cover it another time. So look at the slides there. That's why Gen Z is so stressed. There's a bunch of different reasons.
I don't think that the factor that Gen Z have everything, they have things available to them. Do you not think that that's swaying that percentage?
So say it again, Jen.
Do you not think that the resources that are available to Gen Z that accessible by Gen X's or in the pre-bin, do you don't think that that's swaying the percentage because they're admitting that they have, they're perceiving that they have?
Yeah, so that's one of the factors in there that mental health is destigmatized, so people are more readily kind of reporting mental health issues. So that's something that it's been taken into account. So that's definitely a factor. But there's like deteriorating mental health as well. But yeah, people are more readily talking about, whereas before they didn't. So thank you. Yeah.
One, like an off station, but oddly enough, yesterday I was listening to something on a radio station and they were speaking about like today's that people are less stressed because we are beginning to understand how we don't have to demand so much from ourselves, and that university students or people going into the workforce are more in tune with their emotional well-being. And I'm like, really? But anyway,
Yeah,
it's just a radio
yeah,
guy.
yeah.
They did, I don't know, I think it was like Toronto 92.1. I just found that very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, there's lots of opinions about this stuff. And I won't go into this, but I think it's a really interesting subject, which is the effect of algorithms on society in general, right? Like, so I encourage you to read about that, algorithms and stress. what are the things people are saying they're most stressed by? What are the causes of stress among the most stressed? And this is just a breakdown of different countries and how people report being stressed. It's interesting because I'm Portuguese, right? Look at Portugal, it's right at the top of the list. They're the most stressed people, 82%. Canada's actually pretty low. Look at Canada, it's like about 10 from the bottom right there. United States is people are way more stressed. Anyway, it's just interesting. Okay. And that's like stress in the workplace, percent of workers reporting significant work-related stress. And over time, it's really increased, right? The workplace is becoming much more stressful. And if you're in healthcare or if you're a teacher or many other professions, you kind of know, right? You know this in your bones. Percent of population reporting severe anxiety, right? And how it's gone up. Okay, so we sent out last week, we sent out 2 scales. One was the Holmes and Ray, and the other one was the perceived stress scale. How many people here were able to do it? Maybe just put your hand up. Okay, thank you. So what we're going to do is, if Lauren, we won't stop recording, but let's launch the Zoom poll. And if you guys can hand out. Oh, you already handed out? Okay. So typically, because a couple of new people, what we do, we have these polls. And people are on Zoom, so there's about 45 people on Zoom. They get scored automatically. So we're going to be able to look at their scores. But people here in the room will report it next week. Okay, so if you can write down your scores, and it's all confidential. So, all right, if people on Zoom can do the poll, that'd be great. Okay. We'll give you another minute or so. So there's only 3 questions. And if you're here in the room, if you could do it as well, and then Joan and Nicole will go around and collect them. All right, we'll give you another 30 seconds. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what these mean. Anybody need another few seconds or? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let me read the results. So we had, see, there's 44 people on Zoom and 20 people were able to respond, which is pretty good. And so first question, what was your score on the perceived stress scale? All right, so nobody scored low stress. Okay, and 50% moderate stress and 50% high stress, right? And then second question was, what was your score on the Holmes and Ray? and nobody said low life change stress. 60% people said moderate stress load, and 40% high stress load. Okay. And the third question asked you what category you fell into. So the first category was high Holmes and Ray and high perceived stress scale. That was 59% of people. High Holmes and Ray and low perceived stress scale, that was 29%. Low Holmes and Ray and high perceived stress scale, 6%. And low Holmes and Ray and low perceived stress, 6%. I'd love to be that person. Congratulations, that's fantastic. Okay, thank you guys. All right, let's go back a few slides here. Okay. So, we were talking about the 3 layers of stress, right? And we said the first layer is what the world does to you, what happens, right? So we covered that. Now let's look at what is happening to our nervous systems. And this is where, these scales are important. So your body arousal. And so the question is, are there ways of objectively assessing how much stress a person's experiencing? Right? And so this is the email we sent out, asking you to do these 2 scales. Right? And the Holmes and Ray scale attempts to objectify the amount of stress a person's experiencing. And that's how you figure it out. And that's what it looks like. And we did our poll. So let me, because we all did it, right? Let me tell you a little bit what it means. You might have read this as well. So the Holmes and Ray scale estimates the risk of a stress-related illness in the next 12 to 24 months. So stress-related illness. That doesn't mean disease. It just means illness. You're not feeling well, right? So if you scored 0 to 149, low life change stress, nobody scored that, right? 30% risk of having a stress-related illness over the next year to 2 years. 50% of people scored 152 to 300. So that's moderate stress load, 50% risk of, and I think many people who are attending this already have a stress-related illness, right? So, yeah. And if your score was more than 300, there's an 80% risk that you're already suffering, or you're going to suffer from a stress-related illness. So a score of over 300 doesn't mean you will get sick. It means your body's carrying so much accumulated adaptation demand that the probability of illness, depression, anxiety, or burnout becomes very high unless there's recovery, support, and stabilization. So the Holmes and Ray scale predicts depression, anxiety disorders, immune suppression, cardiovascular events, relapse of medical illness, and work disability. It measures wear and tear on the system. Okay, so I'm not making that up. That's just what the scale says, right? That's what the studies say. So the other scale we asked you to do was the perceived stress scale, and it measures how overwhelmed, unpredictable, and overloaded life feels for you right now. And scores of 0 to 13, low perceived stress, nervous system feels mostly safe and manageable. 14 to 26, moderate stress, strain present, coping is working, but taxed. And 27 to 40, which I think it was like 60% of people said that's where they were. Nervous system is in sustained alarm or overload. So I perceive stress scale scores correlate strongly with anxiety and depression, sleep problems, emotional dysregulation, PTSD symptoms, chronic pain, and cardiovascular risk. This scale measures how threatened and out of control the system feels. Okay, so that's not something I'm making up. That's what the scales say. And then you had the third question, which was, the combination of Holmes and Ray and perceived stress scale. So if you have high Holmes and Ray, right? So a lot of changes in your life, and you're perceiving a lot of stress as well. Life is objectively heavy and the nervous system is overwhelmed. You're at the highest risk. And there are a lot of people that were in that category. If you have a high Holmes and Ray, so a lot of events, and you perceived stress is low, so you're kind of like, yeah, it's all good, right? Moderate demands, but coping and support still functioning. Okay. And then if you had low Holmes and Ray, so not a lot of stressful life events, but high perceived stress scale, internal stress likely driven by trauma, burnout, or nervous system sensitization. And if you had low Holmes and Ray and low perceived stress, system is relatively well regulated. Okay. So won't go over that just for the sake of time, but I invite you to go to the website and read that slide. And this was actually a question that somebody emailed me, and they just emailed it to me yesterday. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to add that because this person kind of said, you know, I did the Holmes and Ray, but there's a lot of change, a lot of stresses that aren't mentioned in the Holmes and Ray. Like, how do you account for that? So the Holmes and Ray scale was developed decades ago and focuses mainly on major life events, things like losses, changes, or transitions. It doesn't do a great job of capturing more chronic, pervasive stressors such as ongoing social tension, cultural polarization, or distress related to current events, and how these strain relationships and family and friends. Those kinds of stresses may not show up as a single event, but they can be emotionally taxing over time and very real contributors to stress. If parts of your stress weren't reflected in your score, that doesn't mean they were insignificant, it means the tool has limits and your lived experience is what matters. From a DBT perspective, these ongoing social and value conflicts act like a chronic validating environments, increasing emotional vulnerability, making skill use harder. So DBT focuses on building regulation and effectiveness, even when stress can't be removed. Okay. So let's go on to the stress response. And basically what that is about. So now we're looking at what happens to us. So that's the second layer. First was the world, you know, different types of stressors. Second layer is what happens. And let's look at what happens biologically. I'm going to go over that very quickly because I do want to save time for the polyvagal, because that's like really key to a lot of things. And we've already touched on it a little bit before. Okay, so in terms of your biological response, there's two big components to our biological response. Okay, there's a part of our stress response that's mediated by the nervous system, right? And that's faster. And then there's part of the stress response that's mediated by the endocrine. Endocrine is like hormones. And so the nervous response is nerves conduct impulses really quickly. Hormones, they're mostly discharged by the pituitary gland, which is in your brain. They're discharged into the bloodstream, and it takes longer. And then we have a lot of different glands that secrete hormones. So let me just, I think this it's important enough, I'll go through it. So let's talk about the endocrine response, which is slower. So this is like your hormones, right? That's part of the stress response. So the hormonal stress response is the body's way of preparing to deal with perceived threat. It involves a cascade of hormones primarily from the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, HPA axis, and the sympathetic nervous system. When a threat is perceived, physical danger, emotional stress, etc., the amygdala, a brain region involved in fear, signals the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system. This causes the adrenal medulla, inner part of the adrenal gland, which is like on top of your kidneys, to release adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. There's two names for it. And noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine, resulting in an increased heart rate, blood pressure, and energy availability. So that's all hormones, right? The hypothalamus also releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, which triggers the pituitary gland to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex. So that's the outer part of the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, to release cortisol. Cortisol mobilizes energy by increasing glucose in the bloodstream. It also suppresses non-essential systems like digestion and immunity. That's why people take exogenous corticosteroids like cortisol to suppress their immune system in case they have dysregulated immune systems, right? And help the body sustain a prolonged response to stress. Once the threat passes, feedback mechanisms help the body return to baseline. Chronic stress, however, can dysregulate the system and contribute to health issues. Okay, I've covered it there. I know that's like a mouthful, and you might not remember all of that, or you might already know it, but I thought that was important enough. So now this is the other part of the stress response, which is faster, and that's the autonomic nervous system. We talk a lot about the autonomic nervous system because that's the vagus nerve, right? And it's more related to the somatic centers, information centers, right? Because we have nerves all over. We've kind of short shifted a little bit the endocrine response. Again, let me just kind of, you can tune out to that, but I think it's important enough. Let me just quickly go over that slide. So the autonomic stress response is the body's automatic unconscious reaction to stress regulated by the autonomic nervous system, which has two main branches. This is going to be important when we talk about the polyvagal theory. So the autonomic nervous system has sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system is the accelerator, fight or flight. Right? It is activated during stress or perceived threat. Right? It prepares the body for action, increases heart rate and blood pressure, dilates pupils, slows digestion, releases glucose for energy, and causes adrenaline release from the adrenal medulla. It's readying you for action, making energy available. Right? Now, and then the other branch of the autonomic nervous system, because if you have an accelerator in a car, you better have a brake. Because if you only have an accelerator, you're in trouble, right? So the autonomic nervous system also has a brake, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system. It's also known as the rest and digest system, right? So it's activated when the threat has passed. It calms the body and restores balance. It slows heart rate, promotes digestion, facilitates recovery and repair, and conserves energy. So accelerator, the sympathetic, and brake, parasympathetic, okay? So the autonomic stress response is rapid, involuntary shift from parasympathetic to sympathetic dominance when faced with a challenge, okay? After the stress is removed, the parasympathetic system, so the brake, works to restore homeostasis, internal balance, right? This system allows the body to respond quickly to danger and recover once it's safe again. All right, so this will be important when we talk about the polyvagal response or theory. So the stress response is the body's way of preparing for danger. When a threat is sensed, the brain quickly releases one, stress hormones, right? They raise heart rate, blood pressure, and energy so we can act. And short term, this response is helpful and protective. Once the threat passes, the body is meant to settle back to normal. Chronic stress, however, keeps the system turned on for too long, which can disrupt the body and contribute to health problems. Okay, so now let's get into polyvagal theory. We need to talk a little bit about the biology, talk about polyvagal theory, which is going to be really important when we talk about trauma, right? We need to understand polyvagal theory to understand trauma. All right. So what is the evolutionary function of the stress response? All right. And I'm going to explain polyvagal theory to you guys, but let me talk a little bit about its history. So this is Stephen Porges, who's still alive. I think he's like in his 70s now. And he's a neuroscientist who proposed the polyvagal theory. So Porges' polyvagal theory explains the physiology and function of the stress response. It describes the different states of arousal or activation of the autonomic nervous system, and it revolutionized our understanding of trauma, right? So now this is important. The human nervous system has been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. It is what is called phylogenetically ancient, meaning our nervous system has been around for 100 million. We shared it with a lot of other animals before us, right? A lot of other animals have very similar autonomic nervous systems to ours. So the autonomic nervous system connects the central nervous system, which is central nervous system. It's what it's in your skull. That's the central nervous system. And the emotional brain is part of that, of the central nervous system, because it's in your skull. So the autonomic nervous system is kind of the road or the highway that connects your central nervous system, including the emotional brain. The road is called the vagus nerve. That's the autoroute. That's the connection from there to your body, right? And the vagus nerve connects to all the internal organs, muscles, and what's around your guts and stuff, because there's billions of nerve cells, not just in your brain, but throughout your body. So like a car, the autonomic nervous system has one accelerator, but it has two brakes. That's why it's called a polyvagal, right? Because there's more than one, right? The autonomic nervous system has these three, and cars, like, if you think about it, cars also have two brakes, right? They have your foot brake, and then they have your handbrake. And the difference between the foot brake and the handbrake is that the foot brake is like, you can use it to make softer adjustments, right? You slow down a little bit, take your foot off the brake, right? But the handbrake, you don't use it to make soft adjustments. It's all or nothing. And the two branches of the parasympathetic are like that too, because there's parasympathetic to the brakes, right? So there's like the foot brake, which is more subtle, and then there's the handbrake, which is like all or nothing. So I'm going to explain that. As with a car that is in gear, so if your car is in gear, right, what do you have to do? You have to gently press on the brake. Otherwise, the car is going to start accelerating, right? So what happens in all of us is that there's always like an emotional tone and or emotional activation. So if we didn't have like a brake, if we didn't have parasympathetic brake, if we didn't have like the foot brake, we'd pick up speed. So there's always like a little bit of parasympathetic tone, like your car's in gear and you have your foot on the brake a little bit. So for us, there's always a little bit of parasympathetic tone that's there. Right? All right. Now, I mentioned already that the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is the brake. Sympathetic is the accelerator. Parasympathetic is the brake. This is the important piece here. So the parasympathetic has they're two nuclei. There's the dorsal nucleus, which is very ancient. It's been around forever, right? And that one is like all or nothing. It's like the handbrake, right? And then you have the ventral nucleus of the parasympathetic. That's like the foot brake. The ventral nucleus evolved in the last 200 million years when mammals came into existence. Like the foot brake, it's incremental. It is concerned with health, growth, and restoration. It's activated when we are calm and our body's repairing itself and storing energy. Our ventral vagus baseline tone is greatly affected by attachment and social interactions. Okay, so what that means is that so we have this dorsal, the old brake, the hand brake, it's all or nothing. But the foot brake, which is newer, which is more subtle, that foot brake is calibrated by attachment. Okay, and it's calibrated by interactions that you have around you, if you have support, right? Which means if you have insecure attachment, foot brake isn't going to work as well. If you don't have a lot of social supports, foot brake isn't going to work as well. Which means that when you get activated, your sympathetic nervous system by stress, well, how are you going to slow yourself down? It's going to be harder because your foot brake doesn't work as well. Okay, let's keep going a little bit. Just to summarize, polyvagal theory explains how the nervous system responds to safety and danger and has deepened our understanding of trauma. Our stress system is very old, shaped by evolution over hundreds of millions of years. The autonomic nervous system connects the brain to the body through the vagus nerve and controls arousal and calm. It works like a car, one accelerator, fight or flight, sympathetic, right, adrenaline, and two brakes. One brake causes shutdown or collapse. That's the dorsal nucleus, ancient, right? When danger feels overwhelming. The other, more evolved, more recent brake supports calm, connection, healing, and restoration. That's the ventral branch of the parasympathetic. This calming system is strongly shaped by safe relationships and attachment. Okay, so the ventral, right? Your brake, the fine brake, the foot brake, right? The other one is like, yeah, it's good to go. Doesn't matter. But that one is shaped by attachment, shaped by social supports. Okay, so that's quite important. All right, let me, so this is like when people explain the polyvagal theory, this is typically the example that they use. So imagine you have, gazelles in the Serengeti in Africa, right? And if you see these movies, typically, they're in a watering hole because they need to drink and there's grass around, right? And there's no threat, right? And they're in a herd. And so what's happening with their autonomic nervous system? So there's like a little bit of sympathetic tone driving them forward, right? But there's like big parasympathetic brake, right? Because parasympathetic is about calm, restoring, digesting, and so they're eating, blood is going to their gut, right? Not a lot of blood to their muscles because they don't need to go anywhere. They're storing energy, right? Not a lot of blood sugar might be low. Okay. So that's kind of they're in a calm state. Okay. Now imagine that all of a sudden, right, there's a lion, like he's far away for now, right? But the gazelle spot a lion, right? What happens now? Well, they stop eating, right? And that first stage where they lift their heads, right, and they become immobile, that's called the orienting response. They're orienting themselves to what's happening around. They're taking in the danger. They saw something. It's like, okay, let's assess the danger here. And then typically what happens is that, probably the lion is just not out for a Sunday stroll. He's probably interested in eating one of the gazelles. So typically what you see is that the lion sort of slowly approaches and, like, if you have cats, it's the same thing. They look disinterested. It's like, nah, I wouldn't eat you. I'm just here like for a Sunday stroll. If everything is good. But, slowly, like in a very disinterested way, they start to approach. But, gazelles aren't stupid, right? They kind of go, oh. At this point, they're still, right? They're not moving. They're just looking at they're not eating anymore. And what's happening is that, the parasympathetic brake is lifting a little bit. So the foot brake is lifting, right? But when that lifts, then you're starting to move forward. Your sympathetic nervous system, so adrenaline, is starting to mobilize. So they're not doing anything, but they're getting ready for fight or flight. If you're a gazelle, it's more flight, right? So, in their system, they're converting fat into sugar because that's the fuel that they need to kind of run. They're diverting blood from their stomach and intestines and stuff and internal organs to their muscles because that's where you need it. So they're getting ready. And that's happening because of the stress response. We talked about the hormonal as well as the autonomic, right? All right. But they still haven't done anything. Then there's a critical point. The lion comes close, and the lion isn't going to chase like all the gazelles, but it's going to chase like one or two that are more vulnerable, right? And so once the lion comes close enough, the chase starts. Okay. And at this point, what you see is the one of the gazelles that's chosen, all the other ones go in the other direction, right? But the one that's being chased, now they're in full fight or flight, right? So they're running away, and the lion's like full chase. Right? So now their sympathetic is totally activated. There's no parasympathetic at all. Okay. And there's a few different outcomes. So sometimes the gazelle outruns the lion, and the lion kind of like runs out of energy. If it's like an old lion, or if he's not in good shape or whatever, it's like, he gives up. And the gazelle's going, got that guy. But other times, what happens is that the gazelle runs out of energy because there's limited fuel in the fuel tank, right? It runs out of energy before the lion runs out of energy. So what happens then? What happens then is that, okay, so now you go from this full sympathetic activation, full fight or flight, right? And the gazelle is kind of cornered. There's no way out. I don't have any more energy, right? To access. There's no fuel in the fuel tank. Can't go forward, right? And I can't fight this lion. Like, he has like fangs and claws and stuff. So in a way, it's kind of like the gazelle is cornered. There's no way out. Right? Because there's no energy to flee. So what happens at that point is that the dorsal parasympathetic, the dorsal nucleus parasympathetic, the handbrake goes on. That's collapse. Okay, so the handbrake goes on. And when that happens, what happens is that the gazelle looks like it's dead, right? Because the gazelle's blood pressure is really low. The gazelle is in what we call shock, right? Blood pressure is really low. Heart rate is barely detectable, right? Very slow. That's what happens when the handbrake goes on, right? Now, there's a lot of theories why that happens. So one of the theories is that this is a last gasp, because sometimes I don't know if you guys have ever seen like fainting goats, or if you've ever seen an animal that's attacked. So I had a cat many years ago, Bolby. I named my cat after Bolby. And he was attacked in our backyard by raccoons. There were like 4 or 5 raccoons. And he went into collapse. So he was kind of like, and we're going, is he dead? He wasn't actually attacked, but he was like frightened. And we brought him into the house and he kind of looked dead, but he then recovered suddenly. Has anybody ever seen an animal like that go through that? Okay. So they're in collapse, right? But what happens is that they can kind of come out of it pretty quickly, right? And sometimes like the gazelle, the lion's distracted or whatever, and the gazelle can get away. The other theory is that if you're in collapse, which is akin to dissociation, right? Which is akin to depression, because a dissociation depression is an activation of the dorsal nucleus of the parasympathetic, right? When you're dissociated or depressed, it's like your handbrake is on, right? The other thing is that when you're like that, it's kind of like the gazelle doesn't care. It's not there anymore, right? So if it dies, it's going to be like an easier death, maybe. Yeah. But there's always the opportunity, there's always the chance that, lion might get distracted and you might kind of escape. Right? Now, this is an interesting something else, which is, I think, really important, which is there's a psychotherapeutic approach called somatic experiencing, which teaches this, is that imagine that the gazelle does go into collapse. Okay, so it becomes, really slowed down. And imagine that it kind of like shifts back to fight or flight. It escapes, right? Now, what that gazelle is spontaneously going to do is it's going to shake. All right. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, that you've had like something really traumatic that's happened to you and you start to shake afterwards. I had a motorcycle accident, years ago. And, I went to the emergency room, was taken by ambulance emergency room, and I started to shake. Okay. And this I knew because I'd done the somatic experiencing before, right? And interesting thing is that if you do shake, it's kind of your nervous system trying to work out the trauma. And if you're allowed to shake, if you don't suppress it, your chances of not developing PTSD are actually better. Right? But, we're kind of taught, you have to keep control, right? It's not a good thing. And in many cases, we try to suppress it. And that increases your chances of having PTSD. Okay. So let's see. Let's go to the next slide here. Polyvagal arousal of mental health conditions. When we are calm or alert, we already know this, right? Our parasympathetic and sympathetic systems are in balance. We are curious and ready to explore. We are in discovery mode. When we are acutely stressed, our sympathetic nervous system is hyperactivated, our adrenaline and cortisol are high, our heart rate elevated, our attention narrowed, we are in fight or flight or in a defense state. When we are overwhelmed, okay, that's the gazelle like collapsing, all right? Our dorsal parasympathetic branch of the nervous system is activated, we shut down or collapse. Okay, this is a form of defense through immobilization rather than mobilization of fight or flight. So anxiety disorders are chronic hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, chronic fight or flight. Whereas depression and dissociation are chronic hyperactivation of the dorsal parasympathetic associated with low energy, blunted affect, slowed physiology, protective disengagement, body numbing, and narrowed awareness. Okay, so this is a different way of thinking about anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders is you're stuck in fight or flight, the gazelle running away from the lion. If you're depressed or dissociated, you're stuck in that freeze response. The gazelle kind of collapsed. And so that's exactly what those diagnoses or mental health conditions are. They're states of activation of our nervous system. Okay. So it's a different way of seeing depression and anxiety and dissociation. Okay. So when your perceived stress scale score is high, okay, perceived stress scale score is high, usually means that your nervous system is not in ventral vagal safety. It is living in fight or flight or shutdown. So your foot brake isn't working very well, right? Let's talk briefly about the 4 arousal states. So, you guys already know this. We are in the window of tolerance when we are calm or alert. And when we're calm alert, we play, we engage socially with others, we cooperate with each other, we're care-based, we feel expanded and relaxed, we are flexible, we regulate one another, we help each other to calm down, we're receptive to other people, we're open to learning, and we are in ventral parasympathetic activation. Okay, ventral is the foot brake. It's like calm. When we're outside the window of tolerance, we're in fight or flight, freeze, or fawn. Okay? And in those states, we fight, run away, collapse, or appease. We compete or comply. We are transactional. We feel contracted or tense. We are rigid. We dysregulate each other. Okay? So people that are in fight or flight, because if somebody's in fight or flight and they approach you, if you respond with fight or flight, you're just kind of like in a feedback loop. If you can kind of like stay calm, sometimes you regulate them. We are reactive. We stick to and defend our beliefs or submit to those of others. We are in high sympathetic or dorsal parasympathetic activation. So if a person who is in the window of tolerance spends time with one who is outside the window of tolerance, and that happens a lot if you're a mental health professional, that happens a lot with us. I mean, a lot of people come in, they're kind of pretty distressed. They're in fight or flight, or some people are depressed. They're in, dorsal parasympathetic activation, right? So we kind of see that multiple times every day, right? And because I always thought, well, digging ditches, if you have like physical work can be very tiring, right? But we're doing mental health professionals, hopefully they're doing a lot of physiological and nervous system work, because regulating yourself and dealing with people who are dysregulated and helping them to become more regulated, that's actually consumes a lot of energy, psychological energy. So you can be really tired at the end of the day, even though you weren't doing anything physical, right? And if it doesn't have to be mental health professionals, if you're working, like I was saying, in a team, where there's insecure relating, you can be exhausted at the end of the day, just from, that energy, right? Okay, this is a really cool slide. I'm just looking at the time, and we're good for time. This one, you're gonna have to go to the website, because it's pretty complicated. But this is really worth spending a lot of time, okay? Because it summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about. It summarizes a lot of polyvagal theory. I'm just gonna orient you generally to, and then I'll let you kind of go and look at it with more time, because we could spend like an hour just on this slide. It is a very important slide. So here's what this slide does, right? The different colors there, right? Different vertical columns are the different states of activation a person can be in, right? So the yellow one there is lethargic. Okay, so there it's more, lethargic is more collapsed, right? Low energy. Then you got the green, which is calm. You got blue, which is active alert. You got the orange, which is fight or flight. Okay, you got the red, which is hyperfreeze. And then you got the purple, the last one here, which is hypofreeze. That's dorsal vagal collapse, right? And what this table does is it gives you, it tells you primary state, apathy, depression, calm, safe, clear thinking, social engagement, active alert, ready to act, fight or flight, react to danger, hyperfreeze, await opportunity to escape. Okay, that's actually the gazelle when the lions are approaching and it's not moving. It's the orienting response. And then hypofreeze is your prepare for death, right? That's the dorsal, right? That's the handbrake. And then what this table tells you is it says, what's your arousal like? Is it too low? Is it low? Is it moderate? Is it high? Extreme? Excessive? Right? And it tells you what's happening in your body. So it goes through what's happening in your muscles, respiration, heart rate, blood pressure. Okay, I won't go through all of that, but it tells you what your body is doing. Okay, and then tells you what you're doing with other people. Are you withdrawn, etc. And then it gives you at the end here, the last bottom column there, recommended intervention. If you're a therapist or if you're with a person like that, this is what you have to do. Okay? So that's worth going to through in a little bit more detail. All right, so let's look at the last kind of layer of stress. So we talked about what the world does to you, and then we talked about what happens in your body, and let's look at what it made of me, how does stress shape our experience. Okay, so how stress affects body and mind, signs and symptoms, and performance. How do stressors and stress affect the body and mind? Okay, so stressors can start in the body. So things like infection, toxins, injury, or poor nutrition, those are stressors that affect directly your body. Okay, stressors can also affect, the mind primarily. Things like loneliness, conflict, negative self-image. But all stress affects both body and mind. Okay, so this is another thing that's really important. A common pathway for all stress is inflammation. So all stress triggers inflammation. All stress triggers inflammation, right? Short-term inflammation helps protect us, but chronic inflammation causes damage. And what is inflammation? Inflammation is your immune system getting ready to cope with a stressor, right? A lot of time, that stressor, hold on one second. A lot of time that stressor could be something physical, be a virus or a bacteria, right? But even if the stressor is psychological, your immune system is still going to be activated by a psychological stress, right? I think that's important. Your immune system is activated by if you have a conflict with somebody, right? Not just because of viruses or bacteria. The immune system, nervous system, and stress system work together to protect us, but chronic stress can dysregulate all these systems, causing them to function poorly or even turn against the body. This dysregulation is linked to autoimmune illnesses, anxiety, depression, and other psychiatric conditions. In the brain, chronic stress can disrupt microglia. So microglia are kind of like they're cells in your brain that go around repairing damage. Okay, they're kind of, like you have white blood cells in your blood. Microglia are like white blood cells in your brain. They repair damage to your brain. So they're the repair workers, right? And when they're affected by stress, And so in the brain, chronic stress can disrupt microglia, immune cells that normally support brain health, but when overactivated, can damage brain cells and connections, contributing to mental illness. Okay? So microglia can actually make things worse. Normally, if you're not too stressed, they repair. If they're overactivated, they can make things worse for you. All right. So effects of stress on thinking, emotions, body, and behavior. So stress, warning signs and symptoms. So stress can give you cognitive symptoms, memory problems, inability to concentrate, poor judgment, seeing only the negative, anxious or racing thoughts, constant worrying. And if you have a lot of those, means you're chronically stressed, right? Can give you physical symptoms, aches and pains, diarrhea or constipation, nausea, dizziness, chest pain, rapid heartbeat, loss of sex drive, frequent colds. Give you emotional symptoms, moodiness, irritability or short temper, agitation, inability to relax, feeling overwhelmed, sense of loneliness and isolation, depression, or general unhappiness. And give you behavioral symptoms, right? Eating more or less, sleeping too much or too little, isolating yourself from others, procrastinating or neglecting responsibilities, using alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs to relax, and nervous habits such as nail biting and pacing. So stress can lead to all of those things. So if you have a lot of those things, good chances that it's because you're pretty stressed. And so this is, people often say, oh, stress made me do it, right? And what does stress make you do? Lose patience, yell at family members, yell at your children, snap at work with coworkers. So a lot of people say, well, this is what stress is making me do. Ignored or didn't take care of responsibilities at home, didn't take care of responsibilities at work or school, skipped exercising or physical activity, cancel social plans, for example, plans with family or friends. And the question that they ask these people is, in the last month, when you were feeling stressed, did you do any of these things? And so a lot of people said, yeah, did those things because I was stressed. How does stress affect performance? And there's a thing called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, right? Shows that performance is best at moderate levels of stress or arousal. Too little stress leads to underperformance. So you're kind of you're lethargic, you don't really perform well. Too much stress impairs thinking and functioning. Too much stress, your functioning starts to deteriorate. You're not performing as well. In short, some stress helps, too much stress hurts, right? So we function best not when we're super stressed, but when there's a moderate amount of stress. Okay, finally, and we're doing good for time. So how stress affects children? Does stress affect children differently than adults? And yes, you can guess the answer, which is going to be yes. So children's stress system are still developing. So they rely heavily on attachment figures. They can't manage their stress. They rely on caregivers to manage their stress because their system isn't mature, right? Securely attached children's caregivers act as stress buffers, helping regulate the children's nervous systems, keeping stress tolerable and promoting resilience. Okay? So remember, this is the anti-fragility thing, right? So if caregivers keep buffer kids' stress so that they have moderate stress that's manageable, that's actually a good thing, right? You don't want them to have no stress at all, right? Because that's not anti-fragility. They're not going to develop. But if their stress is too high, that's not good either. So the task of caregivers is, not all the time, but sometimes to keep the stress moderate so they can kind of develop their stress immune system, right? Insecurely attached children, caregivers become stress enhancers, amplifying stress and making it overwhelming. Children borrow adult regulation, meaning parents or caregivers are well-regulated. Children borrow that good regulation from their caregivers. while adults can self-regulate more independently. We still borrow from, our partners and people we're intimate with, but children do that even more, right? So chronic stress in children keeps their nervous system on high alert, disrupting learning, attention, and emotional regulation. Over time, this can impair brain development, erode confidence, and make it harder to build secure relationships, setting them up for struggles in school, relationships, and coping later in life. And we will look at this in more detail in 2 weeks when we consider the adverse childhood event studies, which are really important studies of stress and trauma in children. Okay. So chronic or severe stress is even more damaging to children than it is for adults. In part, that's because children have fewer resources, such as coping skills, the ability to leave a bad situation, or ability to fight back than do adults. Okay. They're also in the window of learning, during which they form internal maps of the world that tend to persist once they are formed. People's baseline state of activation is set early in life and tends to persist. It can be changed later, but that requires effort and or luck of sustained positive experiences. If they grow up in a stressful and dangerous world, their bodies adapt for survival, and their immune, autonomic, and central nervous systems are chronically set on high alert and activation. Okay, so that's not a surprise to you. If you grow up in a dangerous environment, that's how your nervous system is set. Okay, it can be changed, but it takes healing and growing. If they are overstressed, they don't learn well, which sets them up for failure in school and for bullying. They're also more likely to adopt scarce resource, fast reproduction life strategies. They tend to mature earlier, have more partners and children, and function in fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. Okay, this is the last thing I'm going to do before we go to questions. I leave this for last because I've kind of debated whether to present this at all, because it does create some controversy, right? And I think rightly. So let's wait for a couple of minutes before we take questions, okay? Because I'm going to pause the video in just a few minutes, and then we'll take all your questions. Okay, so let's talk very briefly, just have 2 or 3 more slides. Life history theory, because I think it's interesting, and come at this not from a judgmental perspective, but from trying to understand. So warning, this material may trigger some people, so please keep in mind that these are not personality types or moral traits. They are survival algorithms written by early danger or safety. Life history theory tends to generate emotional responses in people, even if there's good scientific support for this theory, okay? Life history theory studies diversity of life history strategies used by different organisms, as well as the causes and results of these variations in their life cycles. Life history theory proposes that highly stressed animals, humans included, are more likely to develop what are called fast life strategies than those who experience low stress. So if you're stressed, highly stressed, you can develop fast life strategies. Okay. Faster versus lower life histories differ in physiology, psychological outlook, and mating and parental strategies. Slower versus faster life histories are not categories, but a spectrum. So it's not all or nothing. It's like you can kind of be in the middle, right? Faster life strategies are also more common in people with more severe attachment disorders and developmental trauma. Temperament is also an important determinant in the evolution of these strategies. As with other evolutionary psychology theory, there is controversy around some of these ideas, and some people feel insulted by them. I put a link there, so if you want to go, on the website, click on that. There's like a lot more information about it. Okay. So fast life history strategies. So people are more stressed, and this is not like everybody, but it's statistical. So if you have a lot of stress, fast life history strategies are adaptations to unpredictable and safe or resource scarce environments. General pattern is prioritize immediate rewards, survival, and reproduction. Examples, growing up in a chaotic or dangerous environment and learning to act quickly, take risks, and focus on the present. And that can lead to, so kids that are very stressed, they actually have earlier puberty, right? Earlier sexual activity, tend to have more short-term relationships rather than long-term pair bonding, tend to have children earlier, often with less long-term planning, might be more impulsive, sensation-seeking, aggressive, or hypervigilant, may have more difficulty delaying gratification, take what you can when you can, and focus on immediate needs rather than long-term goals, saving or education. So clinical echoes, this shows up in trauma-related hyperarousal, impulsivity, substance use, and some externalizing disorders. And slow life history strategies are adaptations when your environment, when you were growing up, was safe, stable, resource-rich, right? So general patterns prioritize long-term planning, investment, and cooperation. Examples, growing up with consistent caregiving and predictable resources. These kids, often puberty comes later, delayed sexual activity, long-term relationships and pair bonding, having children later with high investment in each child, strong capacity for self-control, and delayed gratification, long-term planning, education, career building, saving, emphasis on cooperation, trust, and social stability. And this goes along with resilience, emotional regulation, capacity for reflection, and future-oriented thinking. These are adaptive strategies, not character flaws. Please don't, okay, that's a typo. Fast or slow strategies, they develop in response to early environments. Oh, sorry. People don't choose. Okay, you don't choose these. They develop in response to your environment. Okay. So fast life history strategy, clinical vignettes. You take the chances while you can. 28-year-old man grew up with frequent moves, parental substance use, unpredictable caregiving. He's quick to act, easily bored, struggles with impulsivity. He forms intense relationships that burn out quickly and has difficulty saving money or planning long term. When stressed, he goes straight into fight or flight. So a lot of holes, right? A lot of holes there. His nervous system learned early that the future is uncertain, so survival depends on acting now. And the second vignette, hyper alert or reactive. Woman in her early 30s with a history of childhood violence is highly attuned to threat. She reacts strongly to perceived rejection, uses substances to regulate emotions, and finds it hard to tolerate boredom or stillness. Clinical frame, a fast strategy optimizing for danger, speed, vigilance, and immediate relief. Now creates problems in a safer adult environment. Contrast that with slow life strategies. Delay and invest. 35-year-old professional grew up in a stable home with predictable routines and emotional support. He delayed relationships until finishing school, saves money, plans carefully, tolerates stress without becoming overwhelmed. His nervous system expects stability, makes long-term investments, feels safe and worthwhile. And I won't do the last one because I want to go to questions. These strategies are adaptive responses to early environments, not personality flaws. Problems arise when a strategy that once ensured survival is carried out in a context where it no longer fits. Being aware of this helps us to slow down. Okay, that's the reason why I kind of introduced this, because it does resonate, right? And it's not a judgment. It's kind of like, okay, this can lead to these holes, right? It's another way of describing the holes people fall into. Okay, and I think I'm going to stop there. Our nervous system learned these patterns to survive. That means they can also learn new ones, slowly, safely, and in connection. All right, so let me just stop sharing and we'll go to questions. I know that was a lot of material, but I hope it was informative and helpful for you guys. All right,
Shall I stop the recording now?
let's stop the recording. Yeah.
Okay.